Welcome to our live training session. I'm Callie. You're going to meet Maui in just a moment. And what I want to start with, since this is actually a live session, is just to make sure that all of our tech is working well. If you can hear me and see me right now, if you could just leave a comment and just tell us your name and where you're from. And as you're doing that, I'll just give a little bit more housekeeping. So how this is kind of working is we're streaming this two different places. This is streaming on our YouTube channel, and we also have it on our page. The page is at crktrainingjournals.com/live. So if you're watching it there on the page and you see the little chat box down below, that's where you can enter your comments, questions, give us a hello. And if you're watching on YouTube, it depends on where you'll see the chat, either below the video or to the side, depending on the device that you're on. I am going to be working with Maui, so obviously I won't be able to monitor your comments, but Julia is behind the camera and with the computer, so she's reading your comments. And at the end, we're going to have a Q&A session, so any questions that you have, she'll be keeping track of those, and then she can relay them back to me at the end of the session. So before I go too much further, I'll just pause here. And are we getting some comments in that things look good? Yeah. Okay, awesome. Thank you for being here and watching this session too. This was not quite as spur of the moment as it probably appeared, but when I went to schedule the email, for those of you that are on my email list, I scheduled it to go out yesterday, but I was in a rush because I was picking up my horse from his surgery, and I was running late, and I just didn't notice that I had scheduled the email for the wrong day to send out today after this session would have already happened. So that's why, if you were wondering why you only saw the email this morning, that's why. We did have it planned ahead of time, but my mistake. So I'm glad that you made it here, and we're also recording this, so if you need to jump out early, or if you're watching this later, we recorded it since we were so late in getting it out. A little bit more about what I'm going to be doing in today's session. This is something that we actually do pretty much every week, sometimes with several different horses. With the horses that I'm riding regularly here, whether it's a horse in for training, whether it's a lesson horse, or one of my own personal horses, I will often video their progress, especially if it's a point that I feel would be really helpful or something that I want to show. We've been doing this for a number of years, and now it's created this library of videos that's the Training Journals program. So sometimes we keep the videos completely long form, which is what we're going to be doing here today. Like, I'm just going to work through a session with Maui like I would any other day. It'll probably go for 30 minutes. It might go a little bit longer since I'm talking, as I'm doing it. I have to sometimes stop what I'm doing to formulate a thought and talk versus just paying attention to the training. So it's just going to run like that. When we actually put these videos in the program, sometimes we'll leave them long form. Sometimes we'll also edit them down to just show you kind of the main points. This live session today is brought to you by Training Journals. So if I'm working today and some of it will be a little slow, as I'm just warming him up, or I'm doing something that takes a little bit longer. So you have total permission. If you get a little bit bored just watching me, we have the link to learn more about Training Journals. You can click over there and take a look at that, or you can just leave the audio running and click back to the video when it sounds interesting. But sometimes I do go a little bit quiet, especially later when I'm riding and I'm focusing on feeling something from him. I'll just be quiet for a little bit as I'm feeling that. So if you have questions about anything, again, please put them in the comments. I'll take questions at the end of the session. I'm going to start Maui's session today with working on a few warm-up ground exercises that are also really good things that you can do in the barn, even in a stall. So I know last week for myself, I did not do nearly as much riding as I usually do. We were running the goal setting workshop, but also it was really cold. And even though I have this beautiful indoor, when it's cold and we have wintry weather, it just creates a lot of extra work here at the farm. And with taking care of that stuff, my riding time just kind of got eaten into. But it's still really nice to have some exercises that you can do quickly in the barn. So even if you only have 5 minutes, or even if you have a longer period of time and you want to do something with your horse, but you're not sure what to do, these exercises that I'm going to be working through with Maui will be really helpful. And then the second thing that I'm doing with him is I'm working on improving his movement, and we're going to be going over some poles. So actually, why don't I just take a walk over here? I'm going to introduce you to Maui, and then I'll come back because I'm going to kind of give you a little drawing, a little visual representation of what we are going to be working on with him. So this is Maui. He came here in September, and I purchased Maui to be part of the lesson program. So he's really a nice, quiet guy, but what I've been focusing on with him is getting him to kind of come out of his shell a little bit. He is, I think the best way that I could probably describe him is he's kind of reserved, and he gets a little tense, not in an anxious, I'm going to do something unexpected way, but he just gets tense and he doesn't move forward nearly as freely as he could. He also was a little stuck in kind of a small movement and a tense position with his head up and his back really hollow and tight. And that's what we're working on with him. The exercises that we do on the ground are going to be helping with that. And then also when I'm working him over poles, it's something that I do pretty frequently for Maui to help improve his movement. And I chose Maui to work with in today's session because I hope that a lot of you can relate to some of his problems. And we all have different personalities of horses, but not moving forward real willingly and also moving in kind of this hollow, restricted way, I think is something that a lot of you have expressed that you've experienced some problem with, and especially if you ride school horses, it can be a common thing with school horses. And what I'm going to be working with him over the poles, you'll see that some of it takes, an amount of skill in the way that I'm asking him for things, but some of the exercises are set up that you don't even need to have the skill with necessarily your hands and contact in order to be able to trigger the better movement. So I'm going to take Maui back over here and just tie him for a second again so I can focus on walking you through a little bit more of kind of what's been his progress here. So I mentioned in passing that I'd like to do something called a training map, and it's really just a way that my mind kind of works because I like to plan things out, and I like the visual of mind maps. So I use them in my training, and they're not, the point of them, you'll see when I start to draw it out, is not following the map necessarily to the letter, but it just gives you this picture and this kind of journey of where you're going, which steps you're going to be looking for before you move to the next ones, and that can really provide a clear picture for just how the training is going to progress. And then you can adjust things as you go along. If you are in training journals, membership's been open since last Friday, so we've got a lot of new members. You may have seen the training maps section within training journals, and also if you're in the balanced riding course, you know that I do a lot with this mind mapping concept for rider skills as well. But for Maui, the first thing that I was thinking about with Maui is his movement. So he had some other kind of little problem behaviors, like for example, the mounting block. He needed to learn to stand a lot better at the mounting block. Walking on the lead, he would kind of drag behind, so we had some leading skills to just sharpen up a little bit. But the main thing for him was this movement thing. And you'll still see it today when I go on that he just gets a little stiff. He doesn't want to go forward. And for him, I kind of thought about improving this in 3 different tracks. So the first one was just physical stuff. His feet, when I first got him, he had front shoes on that were kind of making his toes too long. He wasn't real balanced on his feet. So the first thing that I did was actually pull the shoes and just have some more regular farrier care for him to get his feet a little bit more balanced. So if you've been following my videos at all, or especially if you've been in the goal setting workshop this past 2 weeks, you notice I talk a lot about this wheel of horsemanship, and this is just another example of how I start to apply it in kind of a real life example. So thought about the farrier stuff. His teeth, his prior owner had already started working on his teeth, but his prior owner, the one right before me, she'd only owned him, I think it was like 9 or 10 months. So when he came to her, his teeth were supposedly in pretty bad shape. And sometimes it takes, a little bit longer, depending too on, if you're just having a kind of routine dentist do the float, it takes a little bit longer to make those changes. So we did farrier. We got some better dentistry for him. And then also, this kind of goes into the next track, because the next thing I wanted to do was just work on overall his relaxation. So I worked on this first with just trying to spend a little more time with him. He was also a little hard to catch. He still can be a little hard to catch. So out in the field, I would spend a lot of time just working in the field. And then instead of just putting the halter on him and bringing him in the field, I would do things like just light massage, petting him, really just looking for things that I could do physically that were enjoyable to him and that would get him to relax. So I am not a trained equine massage therapist. So, what I was doing was not necessarily having a big impact on him from really a physical level, but it's still kind of connected. It got him to relax a little bit more. The other thing that I did here, and I'll show you an example of this, was a little bit of clicker training. So what that helped with is kind of this idea of getting him, instead of being so uptight when he was interacting with a person, it just got him to be a little bit more, I used that term earlier, kind of coming out of his shell and offering behaviors and learning that he could try different things and he wasn't necessarily going to get punished for it. He didn't have to just remain stoic. So I did some simple clicker training exercises with him. Basically just using them to kind of get him thinking a little bit more. And then I worked on, I'll say specifically head down. So, this is always a little bit of a chicken or an egg question to me of, which really comes first. When we're trying to take a horse that is kind of stiff and hollow, and we want them to move better, and we want them to go with a more lowered head, working first in that long and low frame. Is it better to work on teaching them to drop their head first and then using that posture to encourage more relaxation? Or is it better to just work on getting them relaxed and then the head down comes as a result of their relaxation? And I think the answer is work on both. So this is what I did is, I kind of, again, I'm looking at this in 3 tracks. It wasn't that I just did this first and then moved here and then moved here. All of these 3, I'm kind of working on the same track. So not necessarily doing both each session, but this is just how I think about the progression of his training. So with head down, now is where I kind of get even more into the mind map area. I first wanted to teach him this skill, just so he understood a cue for this skill at a standstill. So head down, just standing, to me is just like a basic ground manners skill. So we did standstill first, head down in standstill. Then we did during walking, or like during leading. So, you can think of that as just a real basic in-hand exercise where I would walk a, medium-sized circle and just ask him to lower his head a little bit. Did it first from the halter because that's how I taught the the head down at standstill, and then I transferred it to the bridle, so basically the bit cue, and then I transferred it to, instead of just a little tug actually down on the bridle, which is also engaging some pressure of the pole, I would take my hands in more of a classic kind of in-hand position and basically apply the pressure so that it was more similar to a rein cue that he would feel when there was a rider in the saddle, and get the head down. So I basically trained it that way. And then when we went into the riding part, at first I would just do it walking. And at first, missed my L there, walking. At first I would just look to trigger it. So I did this mostly with him using the poles. So I would set poles. If I had him pretty relaxed as he was walking around, when he would go over the poles, he would naturally kind of drop his head, so he just started getting a little bit more time and physical development in that better posture. And then I started adding the cue. So now, I taught that when I take a rein pressure, he drops his neck and stretches forward and down. We triggered it a little bit with the poles, just getting the posture with the weight on his back. And then I added the cue in while he was walking. And then I started to ask for it during trotting. In the beginning, it was just like ask for it. He would go into the posture, a better posture for a few seconds, and then come back out. And as his strength increased, he started holding it for longer periods of time. Same thing with the walk, like we got, longer duration that he could basically go all the way around the arena in this nice long and low posture at the walk before we started doing it at the trot. Same thing with the trot, and now I'm starting to ask for it just a bit at the canter, but same idea, the canter, just right now it's just for a step or two. He goes back into his old way of movement, and we keep working from there. So this is how I like to think about and kind of draw out my training maps for the different horses that I'm working in. And again, I do this as kind of templates for a lot of different, problems or just things that you want to improve in training journals and in some of the other programs, depending, the maps are different depending on what kind of a skill we're focusing on. But you can take this idea and do the same thing for yourself with your own horse. Okay, so I am going to get on Maui next. I'm just checking my notes to make sure I didn't leave anything out for housekeeping. So what we're going to do next is we're going to go through some of the ground exercises that you can do either as a warm-up or also if you have, weather or some restriction that you can't ride. And I tend to think about these groundwork exercises also in 3 different tracks, or 3 different types of groundwork. We can have our basic skills. So this is just, does the horse know how to walk nicely on a lead? Does he turn? Can he lower his head? Can he pick up his feet? Can he do all that? And then we think about movement exercises. And that is, is he soft to the bit? Can he back up softly? Does he understand the whip for taking a few steps forward? Can we take just a step or 2 forward versus, anytime I ask for forward, they just kind of bulldoze past. Those are groundwork things that you can do even in a barn aisle. And then if you've got a bigger barn aisle, you can maybe even do something a little bit more advanced, like start a little bit of leg yield. Start on the left side of your aisle and leg yield over to the other side of the aisle. And then you can also do some clicker training exercises. So what I'm going to start with Maui here is showing you how I work through his bridle. And as far as basic skills, to me this can kind of fall in that category. And what you're going to notice with him is he's not hard to bridle. I mean, I could easily hang onto his head and put the bridle on and he would be okay. But I would like him to I would like to not feel like I have to hang on to his head and kind of control him through the process. I'd rather that he is just a little bit softer and he stands nice and quietly, maybe starts to open his mouth a little bit more quickly for the bit, doesn't try to pull his head away. And a lot of times when we have like nicer weather or we're just focused on riding, we can kind of rush past some of these little things. But when you're stuck that you can't ride, think about, what little things could you what little skills could you clean up? Whether it's bridling, whether it's maybe picking up your horse's feet, whether it's teaching like a head down cue, what kind of things, good boy, what kind of skills have maybe you overlooked and you could just spend a little extra time on. So for Maui today, we're gonna pick bridling for this one. So I'm gonna pull his halter off. So I kind of expect that he might go to take his head away or even take a step away. So for safety here, I do have the reins around his neck, so they create a little bit of a limit. But the first thing I want to do is be able to bring the bridle up without him starting to pull away. And I'm using the idea of pressure and release here. So I brought the bridle up, he took his head to the right there and got a little bit tense. And I'm going to wait for just that smallest sign of where he started to bring his head back and relaxed a little bit. I can also just shift my body. I didn't pull at all on the reins here, but I just shifted to kind of ask him to bring his head back. Good boy. So if he takes his head away, I'm just going to keep the bridle here. When he starts to bring his head back, then I'm going to drop the bridle away. And Maui is one of these horses that, because, there we got a little bit of a movement back towards me, because he's stoic, he's probably a little boring to watch. And he also takes a little more patience because he doesn't do a lot of stuff. Sometimes horses that move a lot are easier in a sense because they give you more chances to kind of get the right thing and reward it. Where Maui tends to be very still. And when he's unsure of something, he kind of just defaults to being still versus trying something different. And again, I wouldn't necessarily make a video with Maui about a hard to bridle horse, because I wouldn't call him hard to bridle. I could easily put my hand up here and put the bridle on right now. He's not going to do anything big to protest. But since we're on this subject of just doing something simple when we can't ride, I thought that this would be a really good thing to just take the time and work through. Because these are the times an example of a little behavior that when you clean it up a bit, it can just be nicer for your day-to-day process, and sometimes it can actually have a bigger impact on some other skills of the horse. So now I'm going to put my hand on top of his head here and just ask him to drop his head a little bit. Good boy. Good boy. Good boy. Good boy. So again, just to make that a little bit more, to point out what I was doing there, is instead of just pulling his head back away from me, I'm just moving my body back a step. And it's something that I've kind of trained him to do. I'm going to ask him to drop his head again. Good boy. Good boy. But it's more of a requesting him to do something instead of pulling. And it's a cue that I know I can use even if, say, he didn't have the reins around his neck. And I got a great idea from a new student that came here a few weeks ago, and I have yet to actually do it, but it would be great for him. So I've used the idea before with horses that are hard to bridle, and again, I wouldn't really call him hard to bridle. It's just that little thing that we want to work through. But she used a fruit roll-up, just a tiny piece of a fruit roll-up on the horse's bit. So I've used ideas like a little bit of molasses, or even trying to like wet the bit and put a little bit of sugar there to have kind of an immediate reward when they take the bit. But I love that idea of the fruit roll-up. So the next thing that I'm going to do with Maui is I'm just going to give you a really quick demonstration of an exercise that you can do thinking about kind of improving movement for your horse. So I'm going to walk over here and grab a whip. All right, so if you're in a barn aisle, you might not be able to do like circles, you know, and say work on having them drop their head and move a little bit more nicely on a circle. But what you can do is you can work a little bit on just forward and back. And you could do this even in a stall. Barn aisle is better when you've got a little more space. But as simple as doing this. Good boy. So Maui has already practiced this a good bit. And again, sometimes he's a little bit tough one to see things with because he just doesn't move a whole lot. But what I'm looking for here is both a skill for him, and it's also giving me the opportunity to practice a skill for myself. So I'm putting a weight on the reins, and then I'm just waiting here. So I'm not increasing and just pulling until he takes a step back. But what I want to feel is that when I take the feel of the rein, horses will usually do kind of one of two responses to simplify it a little bit. When you take a feel of, say, the rein, either they have kind of a relaxation response. So you take the feel and they soften a little bit, and then you can move them in, you know, kind of wherever direction you want to shift them. Or you take that little feel or put that weight on and you feel them stiffen. Like you can feel them just kind of push with their jaw and get really stiff. So all that this does is it just gives an opportunity to practice, good boy, that when I take this little weight, he relaxes. And I might start with just that response. If he was really stiffening against me, I would release my pressure when he relaxes, and then I would gradually work it up into that he relaxes not just through his jaw, but kind of through his whole body, that he can get the step back. And that's where we're at with Maui, is he's pretty relaxed when I take the pressure, but sometimes he gets a little bit stuck after the first step or two of back. And what I mentioned that this is also working on a skill for me as the handler is when I feel him get a little bit stuck, I have to make sure that I don't try to just push and kind of force him through it. I have to just be patient there and wait. And to do that, I also have to practice a body skill. So if I lean into Maui like this, he just pushed back against me because he's essentially meeting that force. But when I keep my balance over my own 2 feet, when I keep my center of mass over my own 2 feet, now I have the ability to make little shifts in him and I can move him. So it's different than if I just go and push him into him here. Even if he took a step there to brace himself so that he could hold me. And if I start pushing harder on him, he's just going to brace against me more. But when I keep my weight centered over my feet, not leaning into him, whether it's the shoulder or whether it's leaning into the reins, then I can make the little shifts that I need in order to help him kind of break out of a stiff spot. So this is the kind of work that is difficult. As you can see, some people find it boring because there's not a lot of movement to it, and you really do have to focus on the small little subtle pieces. But it's great stuff to work on when you don't have time to go out and ride, when you don't have the space to go out and ride, like frozen ground, because you can see you don't need a lot of space because it is about that subtle, kind of quieter work and feel. As I get ready for our next little exercise, kind of your third idea for groundwork stuff, if you struggle with feeling something, so if you're doing that exercise and you're just like, I cannot feel this at all, what I would recommend doing is just take some time to kind of maybe step away or stay with your horse and just stroke your horse and just focus on breathing. And actually petting the horse, like stroking their neck, is really good because it's just a nice rhythmic movement. Because you'll find when you get a little bit more connected to your body and just kind of present in the moment, you'll be able to feel those subtleties a lot easier than if you're actually thinking about it really hard to try to feel. So I hope that makes sense. All right, so as far as another idea for an exercise, this is kind of a clicker training thing. And I use clicker training in this context to just get the horse thinking a little bit more, to give them a little mental stimulation if they're trapped in a stall because of bad weather. You know, if your barn doesn't turn out in bad weather, it could be a great way to just give them a little mental stimulation while they're there. And this is a very simple example of a clicker training idea. If you want more ideas, a great place to go is actually Angelo Telletine's YouTube channel. So if you haven't already heard of him, you probably haven't watched many of my videos. He's one of my mentors. He teaches at a university near here. And in one of his classes, he has the university students teach the horse some kind of basically a clicker trained behavior. So if you go there to his YouTube channels, you can get a whole bunch of ideas for fun stuff to do with clicker training. With Maui here, we're just doing a really simple one, which is a little bit of targeting. Targeting is nice because it can lead into a lot of other behaviors. I usually, anytime that I show any kind of a food idea, I get lots of questions about what I use for treats. And I grabbed a treat here that I knew would be easy to use for the mounting block, which is what we might spend a little bit of time on with him. We'll see how he does today. This is not an ideal treat for what we're doing here with the target, because you can see Maui also tends to be a slow chewer, and it's taking him forever to chew this thing up, so we don't get a whole lot of repetitions in of the behavior. A lot of times I will use just the horse's grain, and they sell little pouches. You can put the grain in the pouch and just give little tiny handfuls. That way, if you're giving more food in a training context, you're not screwing up their diet, and also they can chew it a little more quickly, and then, you know, if you need to, you can kind of move on to something. So we're not going to spend a whole lot of time on this. I'll do it maybe one more time. And I've got other resources, and there's lots of other resources out there for clicker training ideas. He is, I think he's struggling getting it broken up a little bit. It's a tiny little treat, but there he goes. All right, since it's taking him that long, I'm just going to let him work through that one. We won't do it again, but you get the idea. So what I'm going to do now is I just got to put my hat on to get ready for riding, move some of the stuff out of the way for the mounting block, and then we're going to move on to kind of the next section of our session here. So actually, while I'm doing that, I could talk through some questions if we have any that you think would be easy for me to answer.
We haven't actually really had any.
Okay. Well, like I said, if you do have questions,
She has a horse that has similar problems. She's not stuck, but she has issues with placement, contact, and relaxation.
yeah.
Sorry, the comments are coming in so fast that it keeps scrolling down.
Yeah, I think I'm going to walk over and start moving some of this stuff. So, Nicole, I think if you kind of think about the same track that I went with Maui, I have not found any no major problems with his physical state, but with other horses that had some of the same challenges that he did, I did find bigger problems there. So when there's a movement issue, you know, it is always the best place to start, is to make sure that they're comfortable, the saddle fits.
That, she's not exactly sure that her saddle fits yet.
Okay, yeah, that can be a big one, because if the saddle doesn't fit, they're kind of constantly trying to get away from that. And then you can train behaviors. I mean, you can still train them to, say, put their head down, but the challenge is that as soon as they do that and their head goes down and their back is going to lift a little bit as a result of the head going down, if it goes down in a forward stretching way, when the back lifts and the saddle's uncomfortable, it's going to, in essence, it can almost punish that exact thing that you were trying to train if it's like really bad, or if it's even just a little off, it can just make it hard for the horse to hold a better posture. All right, so we've got some videos of Maui in training journals. Those of you that are in there know that he had some issues with the mounting block when he first came. And I could go in depth on all of these different topics, and I could show you one of those little mind maps that I do for all of these, but good boy. Basically, for him to help with the mounting block issue, we worked on stand first, which wasn't hard for him. Some horses, that's like really the best place to start. So we worked on stand, and then we had to work on, mostly for him, it was just what I'm working on here. It was being able to, good boy, move him, like ask for the front feet to move, and even ask for his hind legs to be able to move back towards me, because his strong habit was one of, good boy, swinging his hindquarters out. So I actually taught him to swing his hindquarters back in, away from the block first, and then by the block. Good boy. And that made a huge difference, because when I had the ability to bring them back in when he would swing them out, that was rewarding for him. He was no longer getting reinforced by taking them out and delaying the whole mounting process. and everything just got a lot better. So what I'm doing here is a habit that I have for all of my horses, and I'm doing it even a little bit more lengthy for Maui, because since he had a little bit of a mounting block issue, I like to keep it very rewarding for him. And I would usually just give him one of those treats, but seeing how long it took him to work through that treat while we did the targeting example, I didn't want to start the ride with the first 5 minutes him chewing his treat. So I just spent a little extra time scratching him and standing here. Okay. So I'm going to ask him to walk off. Good boy. So the first thing you'll notice is I'm taking just a very light contact. Good boy. And when I take that contact, he's reaching forward and down with his head and neck, something that he definitely was not doing in the beginning stages of his training. So where we're kind of picking up on him, to just recap from the map that we drew out at the beginning, is he's now pretty consistent at keeping this better posture and more forward movement at the walk. He's working at holding it for longer durations during the trot. I would say working up to holding it all the way around. He's not quite there yet. And I use a lot of the poles to trigger the movement and get him to get more strength for being in that posture. And what's important to take into consideration whenever you're thinking about your horse and your training is taking into consideration your skill level. So for example, if you're not real stable with your own body at the trot, you probably don't even want to be taking contact yet at the trot until you get a little bit more stable. So you might just be working at the walk with contact to say, work on this kind of a behavior, better posture, and getting the horse to, learn to stretch into contact and just have that better posture. And you might not do it at the trot until you feel that you're stable enough to be steady in both your pressure and also accurate in the timing of your releases. And that's where using exercises like the poles can be really helpful, because it takes out that element of needing to be as correct with kind of using the riding aids to support the horse in the movement, because you use a more external exercise to do that. Good boy. Ooh. So I'm just asking for a little bit of the back. I often, it really depends on the horse. I don't have a generic warm-up, but I will often start with walking around. I want to feel that they soften when I take the bit pressure, like Maui was doing. Good boy. And then after a little bit of walk, good boy, I'll go into some backing. With the back, I'm really working on the same thing. That I can take the bit pressure, and that he can soften. And I always think of things in a shaping process. And shaping is just a behavior term for building behaviors or movements slowly and progressing them as you go along. So even if you have the perfect picture of what you want in your head, you want to reinforce with, when we're riding, that usually is in the context of release pressure. You want to reinforce the, even a step in that direction. And I don't always necessarily mean a literal step, but like you want to reward progress towards that goal. Not necessarily always being able to wait for the ideal goal. And what you're noticing here is similar to what we got with Maui when we were standing on the ground and I was doing this. Good boy. It looks like he's doing nothing, but I can feel, and I also have some kind of visual cues, like the fact that he's got his ears trained pretty intently on me, that he's trying to figure out what I want. So again, with this back, I could just lean back and really haul on him and get some of the steps back, but I don't want that. I want him to actually, good boy, do it where he softens and he steps back in balance versus me just pulling him back and kind of throwing him potentially off balance into the back. So with Maui, I do a lot of waiting. The other thing to kind of remember when you're working on teaching a response, good boy, and the horse doesn't get it right away, good boy, is that, especially with movement things, they're not necessarily, excuse me, being obstinate and like just not doing it. It can very often be that they don't quite know how to do it, like how to move that way. Good boy. So it's important to give them the time to kind of think through and maybe even try a few different movements before they get to the right one. Okay, so here you can see he's getting a little bit stop and start. So he wasn't holding the real forward movement. It's a little bit better now, but it's still not real forward. So you'll notice that you don't see a lot of movement from my legs, a lot of kicking and such. I go more quickly to the whip because I find that getting really loud and kicking and doing all that with my legs, it's usually not the best for the rider's balance. Good boy. And it also can have more of a tensing response to the horse than just a nice little tap with the whip. Good boy. So anytime that I work over poles, I usually get asked what the kind of distance is for the poles. And if you're setting trotting poles, an average place to start is about 4 feet. Really, I adjust it to the horse. Like for example, with Maui, I want to find that distance where he's got to just stretch a little bit to go over them. Because what I'm working on with him is increasing his stride. It just goes along with this whole picture of reaching forward with his neck, swinging more through his back, being more free in his shoulder, and taking a more open step. So I want to set the poles that they're just at that length that he's got to kind of work a little bit to get over them in an even stride. So I'm going to make some adjustments, but I'm first going to pick over the trot and see how my trot poles are spaced. All right, so I want you to notice at the trot that, again, Maui didn't start out this way. You're, seeing this training session after we've been working on this. But when I take contact, he's now stretching down. And when he stretches down, I soften, but I don't drop the contact away. Because a lot of times when horses are kind of changing the way that they're moving, it's really helpful to have a little bit of support, and also I can be quicker with my timing of the subtleties of keeping that posture. So like a little bit more rein contact when he just starts to pop up, and then just a little more relaxation and softer when he goes down. So I'm maintaining the contact and kind of working within that of stretch a little more here and soften and soften. And soften. I'm going to come up over my trot poles, the green and yellow ones. Good boy. And again, this is where for Maui, it just takes some of this repetition of he's got to spend more and more time in this good self-carriage so that he can develop more of the strength to go there. So what I wanted to show you here is I'm going to work up to working on a looser rein. And we're going to kind of watch how the poles can still trigger the response. So let's say I was was at a skill level where I wasn't yet keeping a contact consistent enough to be able to support Maui in this movement at the trot. I could still go to a loose rein and use the poles. Good boy. So we're not getting as much of a stretch down as we were when I can support him a little bit with the rein, but you can still notice a change in how he moves when he goes over those. He drops his neck a little bit, and he has to take more of a reaching stride, and all of those different elements kind of go together. Good boy. You can tell that there's a little moment, I'm gonna let him walk, a little moment of suspension as he pushes over the poles. And that is also mean that he's pushing a little more to get that little bit more suspension at the trot. Walk on. So the other thing that I do, and I have to remember to do it when I'm talking like this too, is when I'm working with a horse like Maui to improve the way that he's moving, when we're moving, I want to keep him in the better pace, rhythm, and posture all of the time. So for example, good boy, I don't want to come out of nicely working like that and then just let him go into this little walk and just go around like this, letting him almost stop and then walk again, and walk again, because this tended to be his kind of pattern all the time, and the movement is one of those things that we develop patterns for. So the more that he's going a certain way consistently, whether it's good or bad, he's going to kind of stay with that. So I want to, the whole time I'm working him, keep him moving as nicely as I can, and if I feel like either one of us just needs a break from thinking about that, I would rather just stop and stand than go around in kind of a piddly walk. So I am just hopping off here for a minute. Good boy. See, we're gonna work on something different. What I wanna do is adjust these poles just a little bit for the walk. Good boy. Stand. So this is another behavior that I'm working on. And actually part of what's good about pole work, it may be kind of annoying when you have to jump on and off and you don't have someone to adjust poles for you, but it's a great way to work on just another behavior, which is standing. And of course you've got to be smart with your context. Like for example, I recognize that he has his stirrups down and that he's wearing circular reins. And the reins are not tied up and secured. But we've worked on this enough that I have woo, good boy. That I've got some amount of trust in that Maui knows what he's doing. When he makes some mistakes, there are more small ones like he just did. Yes, for me when I soften, I will come over closer to the camera because I'm going to hop back on anyway. When I say soften, like a lot of times when I'm taking the contact, I'll have just a little bit more muscle engagement in like my postural muscles. So it's going to be kind of hard to see. It's easier to feel like if you go against a wall and you just kind of push on the wall like this, and you'll feel it in your back and you'll feel it in your hand kind of going forward, and you'll feel it in your postural muscles. So it's like a little bit of tension and then I just let that go. Tension and let that go. So when I'm having the contact, well, I can actually do it right here. So here, I'm going to ask him to drop his head a little bit. Good boy.
There's some questions about the difference between that cue and the cue for backing up.
Yes. So the way that I think about it is I want neck stretched forward and down to be tied into any behavior. So I want that to be kind of like soften the jaw, stretch forward and down to be the default that gets connected to like every rein cue, whether it's halt, whether it's back up, whether it is turning. So when they feel rein contact, that becomes the default. As a horse gets trained into higher levels, which frankly isn't something that I spend a lot of my time at the lower levels and working through behavior problems. But the same concept goes into the higher levels of training because you teach that. So even as the horse is in an advanced level frame, they're still reaching forward and out with the neck. It's not the same long and low posture that we're kind of working towards with Maui, but it's that same idea of the movement. So the difference between this and the backing up is when I take the contact, I want relaxing the jaw, which kind of came as he just moved his mouth there a little bit, and just a little forward down stretch of the neck, and it can be small, but right now I've hit just a little bit of a stiff spot. There it was. So there I softened. Now when I went to back, I'm going to shift my weight back. Standing here, I just shifted it back. Even if I do it from here, right there, now I'm shifting my weight back. So I'm just going to wait until I get the softening from the jaw first. There he softened and stretched forward down, but my weight is shifted back, and there I release on the back. So the rein contact, I don't want rein contact in itself to trigger halt, back up, or those behaviors. I want rein contact to trigger soften the jaw and stretch, and then it's the shift of my body that does the other pieces. And really, when we think about what our riding cues are when we're actually in the saddle, they're a combination of a lot of different things. And the horses, especially lesson horses, get pretty darn good at generalizing what they mean. But you know, if a person is pulling on the reins with all of their might, but they're also leaning forward and really stiff, even a really well-trained horse is not, if you get a halt, it's going to be really sloppy out of that. So does that make sense? So the softening it's the postural muscles, which are like the deep abdominals. It's not crunch muscles that tighten and soften, tighten and soften. So like when I was going with him and I was saying soften, that's what I was thinking about softening and letting go with. When I'm doing this, rein contact is soften the jaw and a little stretch forward with the neck. Shift of my weight, whether it's on the ground or in the saddle, says back up or go forward or turn right or turn left. So let me know if that was clear. I'm going to hop back on. I'm keeping my balance. That's it. So I'm just staying really balanced on him. And when I'm supporting him, I'm staying very balanced. And I am, let me get this step forward. Good boy. And I'm being as accurate as I can be with the timing of that tension that I was talking about in my body, as far as like if I'm standing here, a little bit of tension and rein contact to ask him to drop. So I'm not asking for back here. I'm just asking for him to drop his head, and you see the little shifts back and forth. Good boy. Or when I feel him get stuck, instead of just going against him in that locked position, I'll just softly move him a little bit. Good boy. And if I was actually in movement, I wouldn't do what I just did there. Kind of a bad example. I wouldn't lean forward and touch him and like pet his neck, because that would be a shift in my balance, which would make it more difficult, good boy, for him to keep that posture. So instead what I would do, good boy, is just give a little scratch. So I'm doing it here, and I keep doing it habitually because we're just standing. So I can shift forward and pet him on the neck, and because we're not moving, it's not making as big of a difference in his balance. But if we're moving, then my reinforcement reward is basically coming from softening, and for some context I might do just a little scratch right here. Most of the time I'm just praising and softening in my body. And with what we're working on here, walk, good boy. Don't get discouraged or don't get overwhelmed if you're thinking like, this is just way above my riding level. I'm still trying to post and not feel like I'm going to fly off the horse when we go into canter, because that's okay. This is kind of seeing the big picture. So I wanted to use the poles because you could see that I was able to get a little better movement with him even when I was on the loose rein. So if I'm thinking from a skill perspective, I'm going over the poles, and I might just be focusing on keeping my balance really nice and steady before I even think about picking up the reins and adding that into the equation. So when you think about the training maps and the progression of things that we did in the beginning, use that for yourself and your own riding skills as well. Meaning that you might be working on just keeping your posture and your balance. Good boy. You might be just keeping your posture and your balance when you're working at the higher gaits of trot. Maybe at walk, you're starting to just maintain a steady contact, not even kind of change in responses to the horse, but just find where you can keep a neutral, steady following contact. And then on the ground, you're starting to work on those ideas with that exercise I showed first of, thinking about kind of using your center, releasing on the horse, relaxing their jaw, or shifting back with their body as the next step. So as a rider, think about how your skills progress too. It doesn't mean that this is not of use if you're feeling like you aren't at a skill level yet to keep your contact and keep your balance enough to support the better movement of the horse. So you can think about how to break down the exercise for yourself as well. Good boy. Good boy. So what I did here, I wasn't really explaining what I was doing with these poles, is I just raised the sides, and we're only walking through them right now. I raised the sides, I moved them a little bit closer together. And the reason that I wanted to raise them is because it just gets him to use himself in a little different and better way. So you can see as he enters those poles, he's stretching down slightly again with his neck. He's having to think about where he's placing his feet. And I can feel from the saddle just more movement come through his back as he has to kind of use his shoulders a little bit more and use everything differently to get over them. Good boy. So, So this is, again, the track that I'm working on with Maui. Another thing I wanted to mention with the poles is obviously this is not his first time over poles. I mean, we started with one pole at the walk, got up to a line of poles at the walk, started again with like one pole at the trot, build up to a line of poles at the trot. Depending on the horse, they might do that in a session. For Maui, it was, probably about 2 weeks of just kind of learning to, this is how you put your feet and not trip going through poles, working up to just like 3 or 4 at the trot. And now I'm starting to add more. So there I have 5. I'll have up to 6 for him at the trot. And now and then I'll start to raise a few at the trot. Don't get too overly worried about your spacing, because honestly, to me, the poles are really about that, kind of help teach the horse to have a little bit better placement of his feet, be thinking about his feet as he's going through them. So if you place them and they're not great placement, it's okay. He goes through, let him figure it out. You can adjust them from there. And as long as you're going slow and progressing slowly, you have time to kind of figure out what's going on and make those little adjustments. Notice how your horse is handling them differently. And think about working on, some of those different tracks to help move you forward in one direction, but kind of different tracks taking you there. So I am going to call it a day here for Maui. Honestly, I probably would do a little bit more if it was just a training session with him. We might do a little more trot and canter, but I want to have time to answer any more questions if there are any. And I also want to respect everyone's time, because I think we're probably coming up on, I don't have my phone or watch, but I think we're probably coming up on an hour, and we took a little more time with the groundwork stuff than I initially thought that we might. So, any questions? Has this session been helpful? I'll wait to stay on for just a moment. Sometimes there's questions that are actually easier to answer from the saddle.
While we're waiting for more to come in, there was a question from Lynn who said, do you think that Callie understands good boy is positive reinforcement? Did you ever pair it with food? Because I know you also train the tongue click with food.
Yeah, he definitely understands the tongue click as a specific signal. The praise, I think he has a general understanding of, because I have used it in conjunction with food, and I've also used it in conjunction with release of pressure enough times. Praise is one of those things that it's as a trainer, this is really getting into like behavior stuff. This is what keeps me up at night. But I'm always thinking about like which really is better. Positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement. There really is, to me, the two of them, like they're both happening on some level a lot of the time, because we don't train horses in Skinner boxes. Like there's an interaction piece, and there's always a pressure when we have interaction, whenever we make a request. So my long answer to the question about praise is I still use it along with a lot of times that I release or that I reward, and I think that gives it some meaning. I think that horses also do have some emotional understanding of tone, and like I think they pick up on emotion. There's actually some kind of science for this when people have looked at like heart rate variabilities as a more objective measure of emotion. So horses can pick up on that, and I think that in that way, praise in and of itself could potentially be reinforcing, but how powerful of a reinforcement it is, I think we just have to observe the horse and the actual, effect that it seems to be having on their behavior. So, good question.
It's just, the person's name is guest, they haven't put their name in, but they made a good point of, I wonder how much your body changes when you're verbally praising. It's an interesting concept.
Yeah, it really is. There's some interesting research from HeartMath. If you just Google like HeartMath and horses, it should come up, that they looked at heart rate variability, again, as an indicator of emotion, because the more that we're in positive emotional states, the greater that our heart rate variability is, and the more even the rhythm is. So they kind of looked at that, and because of essentially the magnetic field of our heart, they've found that with horses and humans, also with humans and humans, but like we change each other. So the horse can affect us, we can affect the horse, on that emotional level. But again, I find it fascinating looking at some of the more like scientific markers of that emotion. So interesting research from HeartMath if you want to kind of take a closer look into that topic.
And then we had a question from Mary. Would you do the same pull exercises with a one-eyed horse, and would there be any changes?
That's a great question. And the only one-eyed horse that I have had personal experience with is Mojo. Mojo was my boyfriend's sister's horse for many, many years. And then she had given up riding, and he got uveitis. He went completely blind in one eye. And he came here, and I started using him in the lesson program. And he could go over poles. He could actually go over jump grids and small jump courses, and seemed to be not at all affected by the fact that he was blind in that one eye. It was pretty cool. I mean, actually, the story of how we started him back into that, because I assumed that he would be limited because of that blindness. So I was using him over poles, but I really wasn't doing anything with jumping. And then in one of my lessons, he was in the lesson with a student, and she was walking along the corner, and she asked for trot. She did ask for a trot in a way that he misunderstood and thought that she asked for canter. He really wasn't getting worked up or anything. He just thought that she had given him a canter request. and there was a jump sitting on the diagonal. He went into canter. The way that she moved, he again misunderstood that she was looking at the jump. As soon as he steered himself towards the jump, and it was still a little ways out, of course our human inclination is to stare at whatever we think is going to happen. So she focused on the jump, and then he was sure that this is what we're supposed to do. And the jump was probably like 2.6, and he just cantered and went right over the jump. A beautiful spot, beautiful jump. So after that, I started working him over small grids, gradually doing a little more and more, and he handled it really, really well. Like, I never once had him hit a jump, miss his distance, anything like that. So yes, I probably would not change anything except for just going extra slow as you're introducing elements and changes to make sure that, my experience for Mojo also applies to your horse. And Mojo is still here. He's no longer ridden at all. He did end up, unfortunately, going blind in the other eye. So now being completely blind, he's, as far as using in a lesson program, I'm not comfortable doing it from a safety perspective. But yeah, that was a pretty cool. It wasn't the best short-term experience for the student, but long-term, she had a great attitude about it and developed a small interest in jumping after that. So, good question.
Dawn said that they love that story and that they're going to remember to look away.
Yep. Yeah, we always say look where you want to go, and Mojo proved that works very well, because she looked at that jump and he was convinced that that's where she wanted to go. So I'm going to just start wrapping it up with him. I'll take maybe one more question if we had, or if anybody has one more question and wants to throw it in, we'll take the first one and then we'll wrap up the session today. Good boy.
Well, there was one question that Ro had submitted a little while ago, and I asked her for some clarification, but she hasn't gotten back to us. So do you want to maybe take that one?
Sure.
I'm just going to paraphrase it.
Okay.
I think her question basically was asking, for figuring out the spacing, would you just let them walk through it the first time, or can you just go ahead and try to trot through it for the first run through?
Yeah, if you're setting poles for trot, I would just trot through them. It's kind of tough to figure out the spacing for trot from walk unless, frankly, from teaching and setting poles so many times, I kind of just have an eye for it. Like, I watch the horse moving, and without giving it a lot of conscious thought, I just set the poles and usually get them pretty close. But what I would recommend doing is just set like 3 poles. You can start at that average, which is about 4 foot. If you've got a small horse like Maui, it's going to be closer together. If you've got a big warm blood with a huge stride, you're going to spread them out more. So start with just 3, adjust those until you feel like you're getting the result that you're looking for. So again, with Maui, I'm looking for setting them that when he comes in, he just has to reach a little bit more than his normal stride around, because that's what I'm trying to encourage. For some horses, I'll just set them that I want their stride not to change. So I'm not trying to change their stride length. I just want that extra kind of push that a lot of times the poles will encourage. And then I want to feel like they can come around in a nice rhythm and trot over the poles without any noticeable change in that rhythm. So just start with a few, adjust from there, and then start to add more. So like, I wouldn't want to just go into a line of 6 poles if I didn't have a really good feel for what the distance needed to be, but just a few, because if the horse messes up a little bit, it really is, it can still be a good exercise, because they have to kind of learn that visual distance, feeling where their feet are, adjusting themselves, and that's an okay lesson for them too. Sometimes it's a purposeful lesson that I do just at the walk, is just scatter random poles, like if you dropped those if you drop pickup sticks, just scatter them randomly, and the horse has to just kind of pick their way through. It can be a good exercise for horses that need a little more feet awareness, or even for preparing for trail rides and such. So thank you again for joining me live. I hope that this session was useful. And this is something that we do. Obviously, we're filming the videos with horses, like with Maui, for training journals. We've got the whole library of the training videos in there. Some are long form like this, some are more edited and just show like 5 minutes of, working on a specific pole exercise, working on a transition, etc. We've got a lot of different topics in training journals. Membership is open just through Friday. So there's a few more days left if you want to join. One other thing, actually, I almost forgot about this. So after a training session, what I like to do is, oops, I put it over here, is kind of do a recap of what went well and what I would do differently. So I created the journal to help do this, because it kind of provides a structured form and some other resources. But the main points that I would recommend if you want to start kind of getting in the habit of doing some tracking is that you can make a note on what you worked on, especially put what went well. So like for Maui, I would probably put a note here of he started out really soft. Actually, we usually have to spend a little more time in the beginning where he is a little more braced. So he started out really softly. And his trot was quite rhythmic. What I would do differently next time, or what I want to work on next time, is the back was a little stiff. I think next time I'll spend a bit more time on the backing, because it just took him a while to kind of figure that out. So I'll probably do a little more from the ground and then do some more under saddle as well. And anything else that I want to think about for him. I have the space here that, if you can make little illustrations of like the poles and what your spacing was, you can write down the distances so you can remember that for next time. And then I have the section here for questions to ponder and research. From my session today, nothing's popping into my head that I would want to like research for Maui. But that's a really good habit to get into, is just taking a few sessions at the end of taking a few minutes at the end of a session to think about what went well and what you might change the next time. And if you enjoyed this particular format where I was working with the horse and also kind of asking or answering some questions, we do this once a month in training journals. And I bring in a variety of horses. I take questions that came in early. A lot of times I'll actually use the early questions to base what horse I'm going to be using and if I'm going to be doing groundwork or riding or both. And I just, basically we work with the horse, we chat back and forth like this on topics, and hopefully give you a better visual demo of what are some exercises or solutions to your problems. And if you've been considering the training journals program, it is definitely more of a training base. So it's not intended to be a riding how-to. It's training based, and it's really kind of providing that ongoing support, and resources. But during the Q&As, I'm happy to answer riding related questions. So if you have, like I'm struggling with the sitting trot, or I'm trying to do this pole exercise, but I'm losing my balance, what could I try differently? The Q&As are a great time that it can be literally any kind of a horse topic: riding, training, care, sometimes we talk a little bit about like, interpersonal dealings with instructors, way to word things, or just a variety of topics. So crktrainingjournals.com is where you can get more information. The button's down below this video. Thank you again for watching. Hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you again soon.